The Arnsworth Castle Business by John H. Watson, M.D. It was upon a dreary November morning, during that time of year when a pervasive fog wraps London in a damp yellow blanket, that the strange and terrible business of Arnsworth Castle first came to our attention. The very air of the metropolis seemed thick with a miasma of gloom, and the lamps along Baker Street, though it was but 10 o'clock in the forenoon, were already lit, casting hazy spectral halos upon the greasy pavement. Within the familiar confines of our sitting room at 221B, however, a cheerful fire crackled in the grate. My friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, had for some days been sunk in one of those fits of profound languor which invariably afflicted him when his singular faculties were not occupied by some pressing problem. He lay curled upon the sofa, a long-stemmed pipe drooping from his lips, his eyes closed and his brow drawn into a thoughtful frown. The room was wreathed in clouds of acrid tobacco smoke, and I had just laid down my copy of the Lancet, despairing of any conversation, when the sharp peal of our doorbell cut through the silence. Holmes's eyes snapped open, a flicker of interest animating his ascetic features. "A client, Watson, or I am much mistaken," he remarked, his voice still thick with lethargy. "The bell has a frantic, desperate quality. A woman, I should judge, and one in considerable distress. Observe the hesitating yet forceful pull." Before I could question his deduction, Mrs. Hudson had shown our visitor in. It was not a woman, however, but a man of middle years, impeccably dressed in the sombre attire of a solicitor, yet whose face was pale and whose hands trembled as he clutched his hat and briefcase. He was clean-shaven, with shrewd grey eyes that were at present wide with anxiety. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he inquired, his gaze darting from my friend on the sofa to me. "This is he," I said, gesturing towards Holmes, "and I am his friend and colleague, Dr. Watson." "My name is Mr. Abercrombie, of the firm Abercrombie, Finch and Moss," our visitor said, bowing stiffly. "I have come on a matter of the gravest importance. It concerns the tragic and inexplicable death of my client, the Right Honourable Lord Arnsworth." Holmes sat up, his lethargy vanishing as if by magic. He swung his long legs to the floor and gestured towards the armchair opposite him. "Pray be seated, Mr. Abercrombie. There is nothing I find more stimulating than the inexplicable. Recount the facts, omitting no detail, however trivial it may seem to you." The solicitor took the seat, placing his briefcase carefully upon the floor beside him. "Lord Arnsworth," he began, "was found dead yesterday morning in his study at Arnsworth Castle in Kent. The door was locked and bolted from the inside. The windows, which are some 30 feet from the ground, were likewise fastened. There is no other entrance to the room. The initial conclusion of the local constabulary is that he took his own life." "And you do not concur?" asked Holmes, his fingertips pressed together in an attitude of intense concentration. "I do not, sir. I knew his lordship for 20 years. He was a man of iron will and robust constitution, not given to fits of melancholy. More than that, he was on the cusp of completing a business arrangement of enormous significance, what he referred to as his great work. For him to end his own life at such a moment is, to my mind, utterly inconceivable." "Tell me of the scene of the tragedy," Holmes prompted. His lordship's valet, a man named Diggle, grew concerned when his master did not answer his call yesterday morning. Together with the butler and a footman, he forced the door. Lord Arnsworth was slumped in his favourite armchair by the unlit hearth, a book fallen to the floor beside him. There were no signs of a struggle, no weapon, no marks of violence upon his person. The family physician, Dr. Allsworthy, was summoned and could find no clear cause of death, save for a sudden failure of the heart. Yet his lordship's health was, by all accounts, excellent. "A sudden seizure, then?" I ventured. Mr. Abercrombie shook his head vehemently. "That is the official verdict, for want of a better one. But there are circumstances, singular circumstances." "Ah!" Holmes leaned forward, his grey eyes shining with that peculiar light I had come to know so well. "We come to the interesting part. Pray, continue." "Lord Arnsworth was a noted collector, Mr. Holmes. His study is less a room and more a museum, filled with medieval and Renaissance artefacts, armour, weaponry, tapestries, and the like. It was his private sanctuary. In the centre of the room, upon his large oak desk, lay a single object that did not belong there, a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird, no larger than a man's thumb. It is of no discernible value, and no one in the household can say where it came from." "And the business arrangement you mentioned?" "It is a delicate matter," the solicitor said, lowering his voice. "His lordship was in the final stages of acquiring the famed Florentine collection, a treasure trove of Renaissance jewels and manuscripts that has been in the possession of a declining Italian family, the Vincenzas, for centuries. The transaction was to be concluded this week. It would have been the crowning achievement of his life as a collector. The Vincenza family is represented by one Signor Claudio Bellini, who has been a guest at the castle for the past few days." "So this Italian gentleman was present at the time of death?" "He was. He, along with her ladyship, Lady Beatrice Arnsworth, and his lordship's nephew and heir, Mr. Alistair Finch." Holmes steepled his fingers. "A locked room, a death by means that are not apparent, a mysterious token, and a cast of characters with potential motives. The affair has a certain quaint charm, does it not, Watson? Tell me, Mr. Abercrombie, of these individuals. Lady Beatrice, for instance." "She is his lordship's second wife, a beautiful woman, some 30 years his junior. Their marriage, I believe, was one of convenience rather than passion. Lord Arnsworth required an heir, which he has not provided. And the nephew, Mr. Alistair Finch. Alistair is a pleasant but feckless young man. His father was Lord Arnsworth's younger brother. The boy has artistic sensibilities and, I regret to say, considerable gambling debts. He and his uncle had a somewhat strained relationship, as his lordship did not approve of his lifestyle. And Signor Bellini? An antiquarian of some repute. A charming, cultured man who's been overseeing the final details of the acquisition. He and Lord Arnsworth spent a great deal of time together in the study, cataloguing the items that were to be exchanged." Holmes rose and began to pace the room, his long, thin frame vibrating with nervous energy. "The local police have, I presume, sealed the study?" "They have, but they are satisfied with their conclusion of natural causes. I have taken the liberty, however, of securing the key. I am convinced, Mr. Holmes, that a foul crime has been committed. The honour of the Arnsworth name and a considerable fortune are at stake. Will you take the case?" My friend stopped his pacing and fixed his piercing gaze upon our visitor. "I will not only take the case, Mr. Abercrombie, I will accompany you to Kent on the next available train." Watson, you would do well to pack your service revolver. When one deals with Italian antiquarians and feckless heirs in a fog-bound castle, it is always best to be prepared for the unexpected. An hour later, we were seated in a first-class carriage rattling through the grey suburbs of South London, the promise of a most unusual investigation lying before us at Arnsworth Castle. Holmes had said little since we had left Baker Street, but as he stared out at the passing scenery, I saw by the tight set of his jaw and the faraway look in his eyes that his mind was already hard at work, sifting through the bizarre facts of this most singular business. Arnsworth Castle proved to be a formidable Gothic pile of grey stone, its towers and battlements rising starkly against a bruised and weeping sky. It stood upon a low hill, surrounded by ancient skeletal oaks, their bare branches clawing at the mist. A sense of profound melancholy seemed to hang over the place, a palpable gloom that had little to do with the inclement weather. We were met at the door by the butler, Diggle, a tall, sepulchral man who looked as though he had been hewn from the same stone as the castle itself. He led us through a vast echoing hall where suits of armour stood like silent sentinels, and the faded portraits of generations of Arnsworths stared down with haughty, dispassionate eyes. The study was located at the end of a long oak-panelled corridor. A stout local constable stood guard, but upon a word from Mr. Abercrombie, he stepped aside and unlocked the heavy door. "I have impressed upon the household that nothing is to be touched," the solicitor whispered as we entered. My first impression of the room was one of cluttered magnificence. Bookshelves groaned under the weight of leather-bound volumes, reaching to a high, vaulted ceiling from which hung a heavy iron chandelier. Tapestries depicting grim hunting scenes covered the walls between them. The air was close and musty, thick with the scent of old paper, beeswax, and something else. A faint, almost imperceptible odour that I could not immediately place. In the centre of this antiquarian hoard sat the large desk, and by the cold, cavernous fireplace was the high-backed leather armchair where the master of the house had met his end. The body, of course, had been removed, but the scene was otherwise as it had been found. A turkey carpet of rich but faded hues covered the floor, and upon it, near the chair, lay a small open volume. While I took in the general aspect of the room, Holmes was already on his hands and knees, a large magnifying glass in his hand, examining the carpet with the intensity of a botanist studying a rare specimen. He moved like a bloodhound on the scent, his sharp, eager face darting from one spot to another. "The bolt on the door, Watson," he murmured without looking up. "Examine it, if you will." I did as he asked. The bolt was of heavy iron, solid and well-oiled. It shot into a deep recess in the doorframe. There were scratches and gouges in the wood around it, consistent with its having been forced. "It seems perfectly sound, Holmes. No sign of tampering." "Precisely. It was indeed locked from within," he said, rising to his feet. He moved to the desk and picked up the small object our client had described. It was a carved wooden bird, dark and polished, with tiny inlaid jet eyes. It was stylized, almost abstract, yet possessed a strange artistic vitality. Holmes turned it over and over in his long, sensitive fingers, then placed it carefully back upon the desk. His attention then shifted to the windows. There were two of them, tall, leaded glass affairs set in deep stone embrasures. He tested each latch, peered out at the sheer drop to the flagstones below, and ran his finger along the sills. "No ingress there," he declared, turning his attention to the rest of the room. His gaze swept over the collection, lingering here and there. He tapped a visored helmet on a suit of armour, ran a hand along the stock of a heavy crossbow mounted on the wall, and paused before a glass display case containing a collection of Renaissance daggers. "What is this odour, Watson?" he asked suddenly, sniffing the air. "It is familiar to me, yet I cannot quite place it." I too sniffed. "It is somewhat bitter. Almonds, perhaps?" "Yes, bitter almonds. The scent of cyanide. And yet Dr. Arnsworth found no trace of poison. Curious, very curious indeed." He strode over to the fireplace and peered up the great dark chimney. "Wide enough for a boy, but not for a man. And the soot is undisturbed. No, our phantom murderer did not enter that way." He returned to the armchair and picked up the book that lay on the floor. "The Travels of Marco Polo," he read from the spine. "Open to the chapter on the court of Kublai Khan. Was his lordship a student of Asiatic history? He was a man of wide-ranging interests," came a soft musical voice from the doorway. We turned to see a woman standing there. She was tall and slender, dressed in mourning black that served only to accentuate the startling pallor of her skin and the deep auburn of her hair. Her face was a perfect oval, possessed of a tragic, statuesque beauty, but her large, dark eyes held a look of guarded watchfulness. This could be none other than Lady Beatrice Arnsworth. Behind her stood two men. The first was young, with fair tousled hair and the handsome, slightly weak face of a man accustomed to a life of ease. His expression was one of sullen petulance. This was clearly the nephew, Alistair Finch. The second man was older, with olive skin, a neatly trimmed black beard, and intelligent dark eyes that missed nothing. He was impeccably dressed and carried himself with an equally quiet confidence. The Italian, Signor Bellini. "You must be Mr. Holmes," Lady Beatrice said, her voice low and steady. "Mr. Abercrombie informed us of your arrival." "I am, madam," Holmes replied, bowing slightly. "I regret the necessity of this intrusion at such a difficult time." "It is no intrusion. I, too, am not satisfied with the official conclusion," she said, her gaze steady. "My husband was not a man to succumb to a simple failure of the heart." The young man, Alistair Finch, gave a short, cynical laugh. "My uncle's heart was made of the same granite as this castle. It would not fail. It would have to be stopped." "Alistair, please," Lady Beatrice said, a faint note of warning in her tone. Signor Bellini stepped forward, his expression one of grave concern. "It is a great tragedy," he said, his English precise and only faintly accented. "His lordship was a great connoisseur, a man of profound knowledge. We were on the verge of cementing a historic agreement that would have brought him great joy." Holmes regarded the trio with his peculiar, searching gaze. "I will need to ask each of you some questions in due course. For the moment, I would ask that you allow me to conclude my examination of this room undisturbed." They withdrew, and Holmes immediately returned to his task. For another hour he continued his silent, meticulous work. He measured the distance between the desk and the chair. He scraped a small sample of dust from the mantelpiece into an envelope. He examined the pages of the fallen book with his lens. Finally, he seemed satisfied. "Well, Watson?" he asked as we prepared to leave the room. "What do you make of it?" "It is the most baffling affair I have ever encountered," I confessed. A man dies of no apparent cause in a hermetically sealed room. It seems to be a problem for a philosopher rather than a detective. "Ah, but we have data, my dear fellow," he cried, his eyes gleaming. "We have a locked room, the scent of bitter almonds without a trace of poison, a mysterious wooden bird, and a book on Marco Polo. It is a chain with several links, and we must find the connection between them. Now, let us interview the inhabitants of this gloomy fortress. I fancy the human element will prove to be even more intriguing than the physical." Our interviews began with Lady Beatrice, whom we met in a small, elegantly appointed drawing room. She faced Holmes's questions with a calm composure that I found either admirable or deeply suspicious. "Your marriage, Lady Arnsworth," Holmes began, his tone gentle but insistent. "Was it a happy one?" A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "My husband was a good man, Mr. Holmes, but he was wedded to his collection. I was merely its curator. He was kind, but distant. Our lives ran on parallel tracks." "And his business dealings with Signor Bellini? Were you privy to the details?" "Only that it was the culmination of his life's ambition. He was selling a number of his English medieval pieces to fund the purchase of the Florentine collection. He was almost feverish with excitement." "Did he have any enemies? Anyone who might wish him harm?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second. "My husband was a hard man in business. He drove a bargain relentlessly. There were many who felt they had been bested by him. But an enemy who would resort to this, I cannot say." "And the wooden bird?" Holmes asked, leaning forward. "Have you any idea of its origin?" "None whatsoever. It is not part of his collection. I have never seen it before." Next we spoke with the nephew, Alistair Finch, whom we found sketching in a conservatory filled with wilting exotic plants. He made no secret of his dislike for his late uncle. "The old man was a tyrant," he said, not looking up from his drawing pad. "He worshipped dusty relics and had no time for living people. He considered my art a frivolous waste of time and refused to advance me a penny, though he would spend a fortune on a rusty helmet or a chipped bit of pottery." "You were his heir, Mr. Finch. You stand to inherit a great deal," Holmes observed mildly. The young man finally looked up, his blue eyes flashing with resentment. "And I shall have to sell half of this mouldering junk to pay my debts. Is that what you're driving at? Do you think I killed him for it? If I had, I would have used a cudgel, not some damnable bit of magic. Where were you on the night of your uncle's death?" "I was here, in the castle, dining with him, her ladyship, and Signor Bellini. It was a tedious affair. The old man and the Italian spoke of nothing but Quattrocento manuscripts. I retired to my room with a bottle of brandy shortly after 10. Our final interview was with the Italian, Signor Claudio Bellini. He was courteous, articulate, and seemingly candid. He explained the intricate details of the business transaction, which involved a complex exchange of artifacts as well as a significant sum of money. "Lord Arnsworth was a formidable negotiator," Bellini said with a wry smile. "He knew the precise value of every piece, both his and ours. We had finally come to an agreement on the evening of his death. We were to sign the final papers in the morning." "You spent the evening with him, Signor. Did you notice anything unusual about his demeanour?" Bellini stroked his beard thoughtfully. He was in excellent spirits, triumphant even. He spoke of the collection as his legacy. After Mr. Finch retired, we remained in the dining hall for a time. Then his lordship excused himself, saying he wished to read for an hour in his study before bed. That was the last time I saw him alive. "And he took nothing with him to the study?" Holmes pressed. "No drink? No food?" "Nothing. He simply bid me good night and walked down the corridor. I heard the lock of the study door turn, and then the bolt slide home. He was a man who cherished his privacy." "The wooden bird, signor," Holmes said, his voice casual. "As an antiquarian, does it mean anything to you?" For the first time, the Italian's composure seemed to falter. A strange, unreadable expression flickered in his dark eyes. "It is a curious piece. The style of carving is unusual, perhaps Central Asian or from the Silk Road. I cannot be certain without closer study." He seemed about to say more, but then checked himself. "It is a trifle, a curiosity. It can have no bearing on this sad event." After the interview, Holmes declared that he wished to take a walk in the grounds, despite the drizzle that had begun to fall. I followed him as he made a circuit of the castle, his eyes fixed on the sheer stone wall beneath the study windows. "There are no footholds, Watson, no ivy, no drain pipe. An ape could not have scaled that wall," he mused, more to himself than to me. He then bent down and began to examine the soft earth of a flower bed that ran along the base of the wall. "Ah!" he cried suddenly, pointing to a small, indistinct impression in the soil. "What do you make of that?" I peered down. "It looks like the print of a boot, Holmes, but the rain has blurred its edges." "Indeed, but notice the depth of the heel. The wearer was a heavy man, or he landed with considerable force. And here," he moved a few feet along, "are marks of a different kind. See how the soil has been scraped away?" He produced a small trowel from his pocket and carefully dug into the disturbed earth. After a moment, his trowel struck something hard. He worked it free and held it up. It was a slender, 4-inch-long sliver of dark wood, sharpened to a fine point at one end. The other end was feathered like a miniature arrow. Holmes examined it intently, sniffing at the pointed tip. "The plot thickens, Watson," he said, his voice grim. "This is a bolt for a miniature crossbow, and the tip smells faintly of bitter almonds." Back in our rooms, Holmes was a whirlwind of activity. He spread a large map of Asia on the table and consulted a number of obscure, leather-bound tomes he had brought with him from Baker Street. He paced, he smoked, and he muttered to himself in a low monotone. "Marco Polo, Watson," he said, stabbing a finger at the map. "He wrote of the great Khan's court in Cathay. He spoke of assassins and secret societies. He described strange and subtle poisons. But what has that to do with a nobleman in Kent?" I asked, utterly bewildered. "Everything, my dear fellow, everything. The bird, the book, the bolt. They are all part of the same puzzle. Lord Arnsworth was not merely a collector. He was a player in a very dangerous game. He collected not just objects, but secrets. And one of his secrets has come home to roost." He fell silent again, lost in thought. The afternoon wore on, and the shadows lengthened. Suddenly he slapped his book shut with a resounding crack. "I have it. The mechanism is ingenious, devilishly so. There is but one missing piece, and I believe I know where to find it. We return to London tonight, Watson. There is an expert on esoteric weaponry I must consult in a dusty little shop in Soho." Our sudden departure caused some consternation, but Holmes was adamant. He left a note for Mr. Abercrombie, assuring him that we would return on the morrow with the solution to the mystery. Our journey back to the city was a silent one. Holmes was deep in his own thoughts, and I knew better than to disturb him. It was only when we were rattling through the gaslit streets of London in a hansom cab that he spoke. "The murderer, Watson, is a man of profound cunning and patience. He constructed a trap that was both invisible and infallible. He killed Lord Arnsworth from a distance of miles and from a time of centuries." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I began to dimly perceive the outlines of a crime so fantastic and yet so meticulously planned that it bordered on the supernatural. The shop in Soho was a dim, cluttered place, smelling of oil and old metal. Its proprietor was a wizened little man with an eyepiece screwed into his eye. Holmes showed him the wooden dart we had found. The old man examined it with an expert's touch. "A thing of beauty," he wheezed. "A bolt for a sleeve gun, or a silent friend, as the Venetians called them. But the fletching, this is not European. It is Mongol, from the 13th century. Fired from a spring-loaded tube, concealed in a manuscript or a statuette. A whisper of death. The tip is coated with a resin, probably poison." "Precisely what I had expected," Holmes said with satisfaction as we left the shop. "Now, Watson, to Baker Street. There is a telegram I must send to Florence and a chemical experiment to be conducted. By tomorrow afternoon, the net will be closed." When we returned to Arnsworth Castle the next day, it was to a house in turmoil. During the night, Signor Bellini's room had been ransacked. The Italian himself was in a state of high agitation. "It is gone!" he cried, greeting us in the hall. "The centerpiece of the exchange, a priceless, illuminated manuscript, the Vincenza Hours. It was in a locked case in my room. It has been stolen." "Calm yourself, Signor," Holmes said, his voice soothing. "I believe I can promise you the return of your property. If you would all be so good as to assemble in the study in half an hour's time, I believe this entire business can be brought to a conclusion." Half an hour later, the principal actors in our drama were gathered in the room where Lord Arnsworth had died. Lady Beatrice, pale and composed, Alistair Finch, looking resentful and nervous, a frantic Signor Bellini, and the solicitor, Mr. Abercrombie. Holmes had also requested the presence of Diggle, the butler. Holmes stood before the fireplace, his tall figure dominating the room. "I was brought here," he began, his voice clear and cold, "to investigate the death of Lord Arnsworth, which was believed to be a suicide or a death by natural causes. It was, in fact, one of the most cunning and elaborately planned murders it has ever been my privilege to investigate." A collective gasp went through the room. "The problem," Holmes continued, "was how the murderer could kill his victim in a room that was securely locked and bolted from the inside, leaving no trace. The answer is that the murder weapon was already in the room. It had been there for quite some time." He gestured towards a magnificent full suit of polished steel German Gothic armour that stood in one corner. Lord Arnsworth was a man of habit. Every night before retiring, he would come to this room to read. And every night he would perform one small ritual. "Diggle, you were his lordship's valet for many years. Tell us what he did." The old butler swallowed hard. "His lordship, sir, he always believed that a room should have a bit of air, even on the coldest night. He had a mechanism fitted. Before he sat down to read, he would pull on the right gauntlet of the suit of armour there. A wire runs from it, through the wall, to a small ventilation grate, high up near the ceiling. "Precisely," Holmes said, "a secret known only to a few. A secret the murderer learned. For concealed within the helmet of that suit of armour was a device, a miniature crossbow of Mongol design. The pulling of the gauntlet which opened the vent also served to trigger this hidden weapon." He walked over to the suit of armour and with some effort lifted off the heavy visored helmet. From within its dark confines, he carefully extracted a small, intricate mechanism of wood and steel. This device fired a tiny dart, which we found in the flower bed below. The dart was tipped with a potent, fast-acting poison derived from distilled laurel leaves, hence the scent of bitter almonds. It struck Lord Arnsworth in the neck, a mere pinprick, killing him in seconds. The dart then fell from the wound, and due to a marvel of aerodynamic design, was carried by the draught from the newly opened vent out of the window, landing in the soft earth below. The murderer, you see, had accounted for everything. But who could have placed such a diabolical thing there? Abercrombie whispered, his face ashen. Holmes's gaze swept over the assembled group, finally coming to rest on Signor Claudio Bellini. The weapon was placed there by a man who had intimate access to this room, a man who was an expert in antiquities and obscure mechanisms, a man who knew of his lordship's habits, a man who stood to gain from his death, Signor Bellini. The Italian started, his face a mask of outrage. "This is preposterous. I am the victim of a theft. What motive could I possibly have?" "A most powerful one," Holmes retorted. "The Florentine collection you were selling was a fraud. Most of the prize items, including the Vincenza hours, were brilliant forgeries. Your family, the Vincenzas, are not in decline. They are bankrupt. You sold the real collection years ago. But Lord Arnsworth, one of the world's foremost experts, was beginning to have his suspicions. He had cabled an expert in Florence for a second opinion. You knew that when he received the reply, you would be exposed as a charlatan and a criminal. You had to silence him before he could ruin you." Bellini laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Prove it. You have no proof." "Oh, but I do," Holmes said softly. "The wooden bird you left on the desk was your undoing. It was a maker's mark, a signature. It is the symbol of a family of forgers and assassins who operated along the Silk Road in the 13th century, mentioned by Marco Polo in the very book Lord Arnsworth was reading. Your family. The Bellinis are not, as you claim, descended from Florentine nobility, but from these artisans of death. It was an act of supreme arrogance to leave your ancestral calling card upon the body of your victim. Furthermore, Holmes continued, you stole the forged manuscript from your own room last night to make it appear as though you were a victim, to deflect suspicion. But it is not in this castle. I deduced that you would need to dispose of it. Knowing you for a man of methodical planning, I surmised you would have sent it ahead to a secure location. I therefore took the liberty of cabling the authorities at Charing Cross Station. They intercepted a package addressed by you to a pawn shop in Paris which you had posted yesterday. It contained the manuscript. I have a telegram here confirming its recovery. Bellini's face had turned a ghastly shade of grey. His eyes darted towards the door. It is no use, Signor, Holmes said, and as he spoke, the stout Kentish constable stepped into the room from the corridor. Your dangerous game is at an end. With a wild cry of rage, Bellini lunged, not for the door, but for a wall display of daggers. He snatched one from its mount and threw himself at Holmes. I started forward, my hand flying to the revolver in my pocket, but I was too slow. It was the feckless nephew, Alistair Finch, who acted. With a shout, he kicked a small footstool into the Italian's path. Bellini stumbled, and in that moment the constable and Diggle were upon him, wresting the blade from his hand and pinning him to the ground. "A truly remarkable case, Holmes," I said that evening, as we sat by the fire in our Baker Street lodgings once more, the London fog pressing against the window panes like a living thing. "A beautiful three-pipe problem," he replied, a twinkle in his eye. "The arrogance of the criminal is the greatest ally of the detective." Bellini was a genius in his way, but his vanity compelled him to sign his work. Once I had connected the bird to Marco Polo and Marco Polo to obscure Mongol weaponry. The rest was merely a matter of logistics. His fake surprise at seeing the bird was a masterful piece of acting, but it was just a shade too theatrical. It told me that he knew exactly what it was. "And young Alistair Finch?" I asked. "He showed some backbone in the end." "Indeed. It seems there is more to the young man than meets the eye. With his uncle gone and his debts presumably cleared, he may yet make something of himself. It is often in the crucible of crisis, my dear Watson, that a man's true character is forged." He picked up his violin from its corner, and soon the melancholy, introspective strains of his playing filled the room. As I listened, I reflected upon the strange and terrible events we had witnessed, and upon the singular intellect of the man I was proud to call my friend, an intellect that had once again shone a brilliant light into the darkest corners of human villainy. The Arnsworth Castle business was at an end.